Yo, what's going on, guys? It's me, Jay. I'm here to talk about a historic day in the history of Puerto Rico, the Caribbean island, um, which is the day of the Ponce massacre, March the 21st, um, 1937. This day is historic for two reasons. One, well, a little bit of background. Of course, the United States colonized Puerto Rico at the end of the 1900s, uh, 19, I mean 1898 to be exact, at the end of the Spanish-American War. What was happening at this time globally was Britain was growing in power, France was growing in power, and Germany, all these European countries, all these Western nations were growing in power. So the United States kind of felt slighted, and she kind of felt like she wanted to have European colonies, overseas colonies as well, like her European friends, France and Great Britain and Germany. So, as many people know, since the early 1900s, 1820s to be exact, President James Monroe issued the Monroe Doctrine, which basically was telling all the European powers, Spain to be exact, that they cannot play in the United States background anymore, which was the Western Hemisphere, or the Americas, or what would become Latin America. It was also putting France on notice and Great Britain, but not really, because France and Great Britain to this day still maintain colonies within the Western Hemisphere, the Caribbean to be exact. But the United States was putting specifically Spain on notice. You cannot interfere with affairs in the Americas anymore, the Western Hemisphere. So, despite that, though, Spain still maintained some colonies in the Caribbean, namely Cuba and Puerto Rico, up until the 1890s. Now, there have been other revolts um, in Cuba as well as in Puerto Rico. One famous one in Puerto Rico was in 1868, Grito de Lares, against Spanish rule, because the Puerto Ricans at this time, led by Ramon Emeterio Betances, wanted their independence. They wanted to be an independent nation away from the Spanish crown. At one point, they were incorporated as an autonomous kingdom of Spain, but at this time, in the 1860s, they wanted their independence. So, what ends up happening is Spain ends up sinking one of the United States' ships, the Maine. But also at this time, a lot of a lot of American citizens were pressuring the United States, just like they're pressuring the United States now. At that time, with something called yellow journalism, they were pressuring, really pressuring the United States, even before the sinking of the Maine happened, to get involved with Cuba's independence. They were saying Cuba and Puerto Rico and the Philippines were sovereign nations, and they should be independent, should be self-sufficient, and should not be colonized by the Spanish Empire. Keep in mind, these were the last three remnants of what was once the great and mighty Spanish Empire. The Spanish Empire had colonized the entirety of America, but piece by piece, in treaties with France, in treaties with England, after several successive wars with England, after several successive wars with the Netherlands, piece by piece, Spain's empire was chipped away. And then also what happened was a lot of Latin American countries like Colombia and Mexico in the early 1800s, Colombia in 1810, Mexico in 1810, gained their independence from Spain. So Spain, by this point, by the 1890s, was very small. And even that, the United States wasn't willing to put up with. And American citizens, specifically in the papers, were really pressuring the United States to get involved. It's kind of like today. The more things change, the more they stay the same because people nowadays are pressuring the United States to get involved with Ukraine. They're saying, well, look at Russia trying to be a bully, trying to reunite the Soviet Union. Russia is trampling over a sovereign nation like the Ukraine. They deserve independence. So at that time in the 1890s, they were pressuring them to do the same thing with Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. So they need a casus belli, a reason for war, a pretext for war. Like I said, Americans in American history always try to paint themselves as innocent. They don't have all their own ulterior motives. They don't have imperialistic motives like their European cousins. They're trying to get involved with it for an altruistic reason or because they were attacked. So apparently they were attacked by the Spaniards with the sinking of the Maine in 1898. And this was the casus belli. This was the reasoning to get involved with the Spanish American War. So they get involved with the Spanish American War. It's called by Teddy Roosevelt at that time, who was a commander, the leader of the Rough Riders, the Battle of San Juan Hill. That was his greatest military accomplishment. It is called by him a splendid little war. It lasts a couple of months. Spain is defeated roundly. But the United States does not give, and it gives independence to Cuba, but it does not give independence to Puerto Rico and the Philippines. It stays in Puerto Rico and stays in the Philippines. So fast forward to 1937, this incident that I'm talking about. Puerto Ricans at this point in 1937, it had been over 100 years that they were, almost over 100 years that they were colonized by the United States. And they, just like they wanted the Spaniards out in the 1860s, now they want the Americans out in the 1930s. And it is led by a man who, by the name of Pedro Albizu Campos, a revolutionary leader who he believes that it's time for Puerto Ricans to have self-determination, not under American rule, not under Spanish rule, because when the territories of Puerto Rico and the Philippines were handed to the United States by Spain, Spain was involved, the United States was involved, but Puerto Rico was not involved, Philippines was not involved, and Cuba was not involved. So the principal three territories that we're talking about that were fighting for their independence against Spain, they didn't get no independence. They got handed from one master to another. They exchanged Spanish rule for American rule. So by this point in the 1930s, that's it. They're fed up. They want the United States out of Puerto Rico, especially Pedro Albizu Campos. Some Puerto Rican leaders, like Luis Muñoz Marin, he wants he wants the U.S. out of Puerto Rico as well, but he wants to do it gradually, through a gradual political process, not Albizu Campos. He wants them out of there completely. So the Puerto Rican Nationalist Party, the Independentista Party, gets together to protest U.S. rule and to commemorate the end of slavery on the island of Puerto Rico, which took place in 1873. Slavery, like in the rest of the Caribbean and really all the countries in the Western Hemisphere, took place in Puerto Rico. After the Taino Indians, the native population of Puerto Rico, was completely decimated by European diseases and by the Spanish encomienda system. Of course, they had to import African slaves, and slavery lasted from the 1500s until 1873. So these nationalists in 1937 were there to commemorate the end of Puerto Rican slavery, which took place the next day, March 22nd. But while they were there, the governor of Puerto Rico at that time, the governor of Puerto Rico was appointed by the United States. It wasn't like it is today, a democratically elected governor. That didn't happen until 1948 with Luis Munoz Marin, right? It was still an appointed governor by the United States, just like it had been an appointed governor by Spain. The first governor of Puerto Rico, Juan Ponce de Leon, was a conquistador and he was appointed by Spain. So it was still really under colonial rule, even though Puerto Ricans were at that time technically granted citizenship in 1917. It was still really badly under colonial rule. So they go to protest this colonial rule, and the police open fire, and 17 people are killed, including women and children. This then prompts, in 1939, the president at that time, FDR, to fire this person, Winfield, as the governor. And it says, well, and they say to themselves, well, maybe Puerto Rico should get more autonomy and should be more independent and be allowed to, say, pick their own government. And by 1948, that's exactly what happens. What unfortunately happens to Pedro Albizu Campos is he is killed by the FBI. Of course, the FBI in the United States, just like they did with the Black Power movement, and just like they did with Puerto Rican nationalist movements on this, stateside, they wanted to shut it down through COINTELPRO. So one of the first victims of COINTELPRO was Pedro Albizu Campos. He was considered dangerous, of course, and seditious to the United States because supposedly he had planned the assassination of President Truman. Now, whether that is true or not, we don't know. People, even in the party, in the Independentista party, say that he didn't actually carry out the hit against Truman, but he did order the hit against Truman. You know what I mean? So that's what they had him in jail for, and that's what he was convicted of. But who knows if that's true? Of course, independence leaders, nationalist leaders at that time were considered seditious all around the world. You have examples of that, like in Mahatma Gandhi in India or Ahmed Ben Bella in Algeria, and everywhere around the world where there was colonies, even in France and Britain after World War II. They were all murdered. Either by their own people or by the colonialist governments that they were a part of. So the United States was no different. But seeing as though the United States was in a different geopolitical position after World War II than they were before, they were even stronger after World War II than they were before. So they couldn't risk having him, not only leading Puerto Ricans on the island and Puerto Ricans in Puerto Rico, but also, in the mainland United States, because at one point he had tried to run for mayor of Chicago. Chicago, of course, a premier destination spot, probably the second biggest destination spot for Puerto Ricans coming to the mainland United States, other than New York City. And he would have a lot of political power there if he tried to run for mayor in that city. Probably not just with Puerto Ricans, but even with African Americans and Mexicans and other minorities, just having so much power. So this is a historic event, and this kind of changed the trajectory of how the United States looked at Puerto Rico after World War II, World War II, and all the other colonies, France's colonies, Britain's colonies were all gaining independence. The United States would say, well, we're not going to let go of Puerto Rico entirely because, truth be told, a lot of Puerto Ricans, they don't want to really leave the United States. There's a unique position and a unique relationship that Puerto Ricans have with the United States that puts them above other Caribbean nations. economically. And they don't want to really become part of the United States or become a state because then they would be subject to federal taxes, and that they don't want either. You know what I mean? So that they want to maintain that Commonwealth status, but maintain that the cultural autonomy and that political autonomy that they wouldn't have otherwise. And after this massacre, unfortunately, these people had to die at the hands of police officers, colonial officials, but it took them having to die for Puerto Rico to gain at least a little bit more autonomy. Me personally, I think that it should become a state. I think it should become the 51st state because Puerto Ricans don't really have a say over who runs their government on a federal level. Yeah, they have a say in the governorship and stuff, but they don't have a say when it comes to the presidency. We're allowed to sit as an observer on the floor of the Senate and the Congress, but we're not allowed to vote. You know what I mean? So basically, we're like the friend of the family. We don't have a real say when it comes to the direction of the country. We just have to go along with it. But at the same time, we could be drafted into the wars that the United States wages against other countries. Puerto Ricans have been in World War One, been in World War Two, been in Korea, been in Vietnam, been in Afghanistan, been in Iraq. All these Bosnia, Kosovo, all these wars that the United States has waged overseas, Puerto Ricans have sacrificed their lives for, and we don't even get to say whether or not we go or not. So it's not really a fair situation. It is an unfair situation being an observer of the United States. And also, I flash you guys back to 2017, the 100-year anniversary of the Jones Act. The Jones Act is the act when Puerto Rico officially became part of the United States and Puerto Ricans were granted citizenship. 100 years later, 2017, Donald Trump is the president, and Hurricane Maria happens. Puerto Rico really didn't receive a lot of federal aid from the United States because the argument that a lot of Americans made was, well, yes, they're a part of the United States, but we're not obligated to service them because they are not a state. So if we became a state and we became the 51st state, then we would be allowed to receive more federal aid than just the Commonwealth would. We would be subject to federal taxes, but we would also be allowed to put, we have to put more in, but we would get more back. In the world, guys, you get back what you put in. So we put nothing in the federal pot, really necessarily when it comes to taxes. So when it's time for help and when it's time for aid from the federal government, from Washington, we get nothing in return. Had we been a state official, officially, we would have got something back. Now, as far as what these nationalists were fighting for, to be an independent country, I don't think that is a good idea because, well, we saw what happened with the Philippines. The Philippines became an independent country in the 1940s after World War II from the United States, and they weren't really able to make it themselves economically. And now they were an independent country. Now they were left out in the cold by the United States. The United States say, "Okay, you're not part of us anymore. You, you're on your own now." So I don't think that is a good role. It's the Caribbean, and other than tourism, the Caribbean really doesn't have much to offer in the terms of natural resources really, sugarcane and stuff. They would still have to depend heavily on their relationship with the United States economically, in a similar way that the former British colonies depend on Great Britain. Like the former British colonies in the Caribbean, like Jamaica, like, well, not Trinidad because they got oil, but Jamaica, Barbados, St. Kitts, St. Lucia, all these former British colonies, they depend still heavily on the United Kingdom, right? And the people immigrate to the United Kingdom heavily, and they depend heavily on the United States and Canada and other countries that are next to it that are more better off economically. So becoming an independent nation, I don't think is good, and becoming and staying a commonwealth, staying where we're at, is not good either. It's kind of like it is very analogous in a way to Scotland's situation with the United Kingdom. Scotland in 2016 had a referendum by their parliament to whether or not they wanted to leave the after Great Britain left the European Union and became independent of the European Union. There was a referendum within Great Britain to see if Scotland wanted to become its own independent nation. Because Ireland had done the same thing in the 1920s, and then in 1949, first they became a free state in the 1920s, and then in 1949 they became their own country. And they haven't really done that well economically apart from the United Kingdom. So there was a referendum if Scotland wanted to do the same thing, and the referendum was voted down because Scottish people, like Puerto Rican people, yes, they're part of the UK politically, but they are very independent, they are very self sufficient, and they think of themselves as a distinct people from the English people. In fact, they've had a lot of wars with the English people over the centuries. One of the most famous ones was covered in the 1995 movie Braveheart. Um, so it's similar like that with Puerto Rico, and in other countries there are similar situations. In fact, even in Spain itself, the Catalan region of northwestern Spain has voted several times to see if they wanted to leave the country of Spain and become its own region, but that was voted down. But in short, I think this rebellion was significant, and I admire the push that people like Lolita Labron and Pedro Aviso Campos had for autonomy and independence for Boricuas. But I don't think, uh, knowing how other countries turned out, specifically Cuba and other Caribbean countries like the Dominican Republic, that even though they're independent countries, they still have to rely heavily on um, USA. They would still be emboldened to the U.S. economically, but then the U.S. would not be obligated to help them out anymore, even less than they are now. And remaining a Commonwealth, well, when situations like Hurricane Maria happened, even though Trump was an asshole, and you might say, well, of course, he doesn't really have a large Hispanic constituency either on the mainland United States or in Puerto Rico, necessarily because the people are majority Democrats or whatever, right? But so they wouldn't have voted for him anyway, even if it was a state. But still, he was wrong, but he was right from a technical standpoint. The United States is not really obligated to give help to them in a federal. They're not obligated to receive a lot of federal money because they're just a commonwealth, and they don't put in to the federal pot. You know, so they're obligated. It's like when you live in your mom's basement. Okay, you live in your mom's basement, but you live in the basement. She's obligated to help you somewhat, but you wanted your own autonomy. There, you have your own autonomy. But She's not obligated to help you in the same way that she would be obligated to help you if you lived upstairs, right? And it would be even worse if you moved completely out to another place. You know what I mean? To your own independent place. You would have more independence, but you would have more responsibilities as well. So I feel like my opinion as a Puerto Rican, you know, from New York, and from the mainland United States, is that we should we should have a seat at the table and a vote. We should move to the upstairs apartment and become officially part of the family of the United States and join the United States and add a 51st star to the American flag. As far as the language situation, people say, well, the language, right? When before all this stuff was happening, like in 37 or um in you know 1917, like during the really heavy colonial period in Puerto Rico, um they tried to force English on Puerto Rico, right? And they banned the use of the Spanish language in schools, and which is the Spanish language is a part of Puerto Rican heritage. The Puerto Ricans are Hispanic people. You know what I mean? So um, that was a thing. They did the same thing, to the Native American kids in the Indian schools. That if we join the United States tomorrow, that wouldn't happen anymore because now the United States is a more multicultural nation. It recognizes the autonomy of Hispanic peoples in there are bilingual states in the United States right now. California is one of them. New Mexico is one of them. Um, Parts of Texas that were formerly part of Mexico that have a huge Hispanic population, Spanish speaking population, have bilingualism written into their constitutions. So that wouldn't really happen, you know, if Puerto Rico would have become a part of the United States. So there is autonomy for certain states recognizing their culture, just like there's with Utah with religion. Utah is a majority Mormon state. Mormons have different religious practices than the rest of the United States, but the United States government respects the Mormon religion. They respect the autonomy of the Mormon people and the autonomy of the state of Utah. Granted, Mormonism is majority white, but even for Native American nations and even for Hispanic populations, there is still that respect for different ways of life and within the United States, and those populations still get a say so in how the country is run and who runs the country on a federal level. Puerto Rico does not get that, and they should, because if you're gonna um if my fate is in question, I should be able to my people and us should be able to vote on how our fate is gonna go. We should have a say so in our destiny. And the United States is ruling over Puerto Rico from Washington D.C., but we don't have a say in what goes on in Washington D.C., and we should. And Washington D.C., by the way, should have a say on what goes on too. Washington D.C. is an unincorporated district and is not a state. One of the funniest things with us is when I was a kid, right? You would ask people, well, how many states does the United States have? And some people, through what is called the phenomenon of the Mandela Effect, they would say that the United States has 52 states. Well, it would have 52 states if you made Washington, D.C., the unincorporated federal district, into a state, and if you made Puerto Rico into a state. Well, I don't know This really doesn't have anything to do with Washington, D.C., technically. But as far as Puerto Rico, yes, it should be a state of the United States. We should have a say in what goes on, how the fate of our island and the destiny of our island. And we would still be allowed to maintain autonomous status. We would still be allowed to maintain our own identity as Puerto Ricans, as Hispanics, but have a say so in who gets elected president. And we could have a senator, we could have members in the House of Representatives. That's only fair. As far as what the nationalists wanted, I think that was a time of nationalist fervor. That was a time when a lot of colonies were gaining independence from France, gaining independence from Britain. Some were gaining independence from Germany, just like the time before that in the early 1900s, when a lot of countries were, European countries, Western countries were colonizing those kind of countries, and the independentistas were caught up in that fervor, that fever, and that was a different time. But we saw how those kind of movements panned out for those people, and we wouldn't want that for our nation. You know what I mean? We wouldn't want that for our people. We would still be emboldened to the United States economically, but the United States wouldn't have any obligation to us. So we have our own identity, we have our own status as a nation. You know what I mean? But we should also have a status officially at the table and not just granted observer status. You know what I mean? That's the way I feel. We are Americans. We serve in America's wars. Our fate is decided federally by the American Union. So we should be allowed to join the American Union and we should be allowed to have a say. One person, one vote. That's the way democracy works. So that's what I believe. I don't discount the sacrifices of the nationalists. I feel like they were trying to make a better world for Puerto Ricans, more freedom, more autonomy. But that has been obtained, and I respect them, but I respectfully disagree with them. I vote to join the United States. Peace.